Nestled in the quiet town of Weaver's Hollow, the Weavers' Funeral Home had stood for nearly a century, enduring as a solemn monument to the town's long and often tragic history. It was widely whispered among locals that Weaver's Funeral Home was the most haunted funeral parlor in the United States. Many avoided the place, even during the day, for it was said to hold echoes of the past and spirits who had never found peace. Thomas Weaver, the current owner and a direct descendant of the original founder, was a man in his late 50s. His hair had started to gray, and his face bore the lines of years spent in the shadow of death. Yet, he remained dedicated to his family's legacy, performing his duties with a stoic demeanor that masked any personal unease. Late one fog-laden evening, Thomas received a call about a sudden death in town. The deceased was an elderly woman named Agnes Palmer, who had been a recluse in her later years. As Thomas drove through the misty streets to the funeral home, the wind whistled through the trees, sounding almost like whispers. He shook off the unsettling feeling and focused on the task ahead. Upon arriving, Thomas unlocked the heavy oak doors of the funeral home, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty rooms. He switched on the dim lights, which cast long shadows that seemed to flicker and dance. Thomas pushed the eerie thoughts aside and set about his work. Agnes Palmer lay on the preparation table, her face pale but peaceful in death. Thomas began the meticulous process of preparing her body for the funeral. As he worked, he felt a chill that wasn't due to the coldness of the room. The air seemed to grow heavy, pressing down on him as if the very walls were watching. As Thomas leaned in to close Agnes's eyes, her hand twitched. He froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He waited, heart pounding, but the hand lay still. Thomas took a deep breath, telling himself it was just a muscle spasm, a natural post-mortem occurrence. He resumed his work, but moments later, Agnes's eyes flew open. Her once dull eyes now shone with an otherworldly light, and she slowly sat up. Thomas stumbled backward, a gasp escaping his lips. Agnes's hand reached out and clamped down on his wrist with a grip like iron. Thomas tried to pull away, but her strength was inexplicable. His heart raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Then, he heard it, a whispering, faint at first but growing louder, a chorus of voices echoing through the room. They spoke in a language he could not understand, but the tone was unmistakably malevolent. "Help us," a voice rasped, distinct among the others. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized it was not just Agnes who was speaking, but countless voices, layered and overlapping, each more desperate than the last. He looked into Agnes's eyes, which were no longer her own but windows into a dark abyss. He saw shadows swirling, faces contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Thomas felt a tugging at his very soul, a pull toward the darkness that threatened to consume him. With a surge of adrenaline, Thomas wrenched his hand free from Agnes's grasp and stumbled back. He reached for the door, his fingers fumbling with the lock in his panic. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive cacophony. Finally, the door swung open, and Thomas fled into the night, the voices chasing him out into the fog. He ran until he reached the edge of town, where he collapsed, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of his pounding heart and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, when Thomas returned with the local authorities, they found Agnes lying peacefully on the table, her eyes closed as if she had never moved. The funeral home was silent, the oppressive atmosphere of the previous night gone. But Thomas knew what he had experienced. He could still feel the cold grip on his wrist and hear the haunting whispers in his mind. He knew that Weaver's funeral home was more than just a place for the dead, it was a doorway to something far darker, where the restless spirits of Weaver's Hollow waited, whispering their secrets to anyone who dared to listen. From that day forward, Thomas kept a lantern lit in the funeral home at all times, a beacon against the darkness. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the voices called again, and he would have to face the whispering crypt of Weaver's funeral home once more.